The entire cafeteria went silent in less than a second, and before the school day was over, a chain of events had already begun that would change our town forever. My name is Hannah Brooks, and until that Friday afternoon, I thought people like Chloe Whitmore always won. At 17 years old, Chloe had everything most students could only imagine. She was popular, wealthy, and untouchable. More importantly, she was the daughter of Mayor Stephen Whitmore, the most powerful man in our town. Teachers treated her differently. Students avoided crossing her. Even parents seemed careful when her family was mentioned. Everyone knew who she was, and everyone knew it was easier to stay out of her way. Lunch period had started like any other day. The cafeteria buzzed with conversation. Trays rattled against tables. Students laughed, shared stories, and counted down the hours until the weekend. I sat with two friends near the windows overlooking the football field. Nothing felt unusual. Then Chloe walked over. The moment she approached our table, I noticed the change in the room. Conversations became quieter. People looked up from their food. A few students exchanged nervous glances. Chloe thrived on attention. She always had. She stood beside our table with several of her friends behind her and immediately started making comments. At first, I ignored them. That was usually the safest choice. But Chloe seemed determined to create a scene. She mocked my clothes. She criticized a project I had recently presented in class. Then she made a joke loud enough for nearby tables to hear. Her friends laughed on cue. I remember feeling embarrassed, but mostly confused. We barely knew each other. I had never given her a reason to dislike me. Still, she continued. The tension grew heavier with each passing second. Finally, I looked up and calmly asked her to leave us alone. The reaction was immediate. Chloe's expression changed. She was not used to hearing the word no. For a brief moment, nobody moved. Then the situation escalated in a way that shocked everyone around us. Gasps echoed across the cafeteria. A fork clattered onto the floor somewhere behind me. Several students stood from their seats. Others pulled out their phones. The noise that usually filled the room disappeared completely. Hundreds of eyes were suddenly focused on a single moment. Chloe looked around confidently, almost as if she expected admiration instead of consequences. That was when I realized something important. She truly believed nothing would happen to her. Why would it? Her father ran the town. Rules always seemed different for people like the Whitmores. I slowly picked up the phone that had fallen beside my tray and looked around the cafeteria. Students were staring in disbelief. Some looked uncomfortable. Others looked afraid. A few were already whispering among themselves. Chloe smirked and turned away with her friends as if the entire incident were beneath her concern. She believed the story was over. She believed she had won. What she did not know was that dozens of students had witnessed everything. What she did not know was that several cameras had been recording. And what she definitely did not know was that the person she had chosen to humiliate was connected to a secret her family never saw coming. I stood up, picked up my backpack, and walked toward the cafeteria doors. I did not cry. I did not argue. I did not chase after Chloe. As I stepped into the hallway, my phone vibrated with a message from my mother. Looking back now, that message marked the beginning of the end for everything the Whitmore family thought they controlled. The hallway outside the cafeteria felt strangely quiet after everything that had happened. Students stood in small groups whispering as I walked past them. Some looked sympathetic. Others looked nervous. A few quickly looked away when our eyes met. News traveled fast in high school, and by the time I reached my locker, everyone already seemed to know what had happened. My phone buzzed again. The message from my mother was simple. Come straight home after school. We need to talk. There was nothing unusual about the words themselves, but something about them felt different. My mother was rarely dramatic. She believed in solving problems calmly and privately. If she said we needed to talk, it usually meant something important. The rest of the school day passed slowly. In every class, students exchanged glances. Teachers seemed distracted. More than once I caught people looking at me before quickly turning away. Chloe, meanwhile, carried on as if nothing had happened. During the final period, I saw her laughing with friends near the parking lot. Her confidence had not changed. If anything, she looked even more certain that she was untouchable. That certainty stayed with me all afternoon. By the time I arrived home, I found my mother sitting at the kitchen table with 2 mugs of tea waiting. Laura Brooks had always been the calmest person I knew. Even during difficult times, she never seemed rattled. But that afternoon, there was something unusual in her expression. Not fear, Not anger. Determination. I sat down across from her. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Then she asked me to tell her exactly what happened. I described everything from beginning to end. The comments, the crowd, the reaction afterward. She listened carefully without interrupting. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and stared quietly through the kitchen window. I was hoping this day would never come, she finally said. The statement caught me off guard. What do you mean? I asked. She folded her hands together. There are things about the Whitmore family you do not know. Suddenly the room felt smaller. Outside, a lawn mower hummed somewhere down the street. A dog barked in the distance. Ordinary sounds filled the silence while I waited for her to continue. Instead, she stood and walked toward a cabinet near the living room. From the bottom drawer, she removed an old folder I had never seen before. The edges were worn from age. Dust covered part of the cover. She placed it carefully on the table between us. My heart began to beat faster. Whatever was inside had clearly been hidden for years. My mother looked at the folder for several seconds before meeting my eyes. Everything started long before you were born, she said quietly. And Stephen Whitmore has spent years making sure nobody ever talked about it. Then she slowly opened the folder, and the first thing I saw made me realize this story was far bigger than a high school incident. For several seconds, I could not take my eyes off the photograph lying on top of the documents. It showed my mother standing beside a much younger Stephen Whitmore nearly 20 years earlier. They were outside City Hall, smiling for a local newspaper camera. The image made no sense. I looked up at her in confusion. You knew him? I asked. Laura Brooks nodded slowly. Long before he became mayor. She sat down across from me and carefully turned another page. Inside the folder were newspaper clippings, meeting records, and letters that had clearly been preserved for years. Some were faded with age. Others looked as though they had been reviewed many times. I felt as if I were looking into a part of my mother's life she had intentionally kept hidden. When I was younger, I worked for a community development committee, she explained. Back then, Stephen Whitmore was trying to build his political career. He promised a lot of things to a lot of people. Her voice remained calm, but I could sense disappointment beneath every word. She showed me an article describing a major project that had supposedly helped local families years ago. Then she pointed to handwritten notes attached to the page. The notes told a very different story. According to the documents, several promises had never been fulfilled. Funding had disappeared. Records had been altered. Complaints had quietly vanished before reaching public attention. Why did nobody say anything? I asked. My mother gave a sad smile. Some people tried. She turned another page. More names appeared. Former employees, community leaders, residents who had questioned certain decisions. Many had eventually left town. Others simply stopped speaking publicly. As I listened, I began to understand why she had looked so serious earlier. This was not about one student being embarrassed at school. This was about years of people staying silent because they believed challenging the wrong person would accomplish nothing. The folder contained evidence that powerful people had relied on that silence. My phone buzzed on the kitchen table. A message from one of my classmates appeared on the screen. The cafeteria video was spreading. More students were sharing it. Several parents had already contacted the school demanding answers. I showed the message to my mother. She read it quietly and nodded. Then the timing may finally be right. Those words sent a chill through me. She stood and walked toward the counter where her phone rested beside a bowl of fruit. For a long moment, she stared at it without moving. It was obvious she had spent years deciding whether to make a certain choice. Finally, she picked it up. There is someone who needs to see these documents, she said. Someone who can no longer be ignored. I watched as she scrolled through her contacts. My heart pounded harder with every second. Outside, evening shadows stretched across our backyard. Inside, the kitchen felt charged with anticipation. My mother stopped on a single number and pressed call. The line rang once, then twice. On the third ring, someone answered immediately. The expression on my mother's face changed the moment she heard the voice on the other end. And in that instant, I realized this conversation was about to set something much larger in motion than either Chloe Whitmore or her father could possibly imagine. The call lasted less than 10 minutes, but the effect was immediate. I could tell from my mother's expression that the person on the other end had taken every word seriously. When she finally ended the call, she sat quietly for a moment and looked at the folder spread across the kitchen table. What happens now? I asked. Laura Brooks carefully closed the folder and folded her hands. Now we wait. Waiting turned out to be harder than I expected. The next morning, our town felt exactly the same on the surface. Cars moved through downtown. Businesses opened their doors. Students filled the hallways at school. Yet beneath that normal routine, something was changing. Everyone was talking about the cafeteria incident. The video had spread far beyond our school. Parents were discussing it online. Community groups were sharing it. Even local reporters had started asking questions. When I arrived at school, I immediately noticed the difference. Students who had ignored me before now nodded as I passed. Some quietly told me they were sorry for what happened. Others admitted they had seen Chloe mistreat people for years, but never felt comfortable speaking up. For the first time, people seemed less afraid. Chloe noticed the change too. During lunch, she sat with her usual group, but the atmosphere around her felt different. Conversations stopped when she approached. Students who once competed for her attention now kept their distance. She tried to act confident, but confidence becomes difficult when public opinion begins to shift. Meanwhile, inside the administration building, another kind of pressure was building. Principal Robert Jenkins released a statement promising a review of the incident. It sounded professional, but few people believed it would lead anywhere. For years, many residents assumed that problems connected to the Whitmore family quietly disappeared. This time felt different. By the afternoon, rumors began circulating through town. Reporters had requested records. Community leaders were asking questions. People who had remained silent for years suddenly seemed willing to talk. That evening, my mother received another phone call. She listened carefully while pacing the living room. I could only hear one side of the conversation, but I understood enough. The person she had contacted was not working alone. Documents were being reviewed. Interviews were being scheduled. Old concerns that had never received attention were finally being examined. After she ended the call, she looked both relieved and concerned. "The process has started," she said quietly. "And once it starts, it becomes very difficult to stop." Across town, Mayor Stephen Whitmore was preparing for a city council meeting. Publicly, he appeared calm. News cameras captured the same confident smile residents had seen for years. But confidence can be misleading. Behind closed doors, questions were already reaching his office. Questions about old decisions. Questions about records. Questions about people who had spent years trying to be heard. The cafeteria video may have started the conversation, but it was no longer the main story. It had become the spark that illuminated something much larger. Late that night, as I prepared for bed, my phone lit up with a notification from a local news outlet. The headline was short, but the impact was enormous. A formal inquiry had just been announced, and for the first time in a very long time, someone was officially looking into the past Stephen Whitmore had worked so hard to leave behind. The following week felt unlike anything our town had experienced in years. Every day seemed to bring a new development. Local news stations covered the inquiry. Community forums filled with discussions. People who had once avoided political conversations suddenly shared stories of their own experiences. It was as though a door had opened, and behind it were years of concerns that had never been fully addressed. At school, the atmosphere continued to shift. Students were no longer focused solely on what happened in the cafeteria. Now they were talking about accountability. Teachers encouraged respectful discussions about leadership and responsibility. For the first time, many students seemed to understand that actions have consequences regardless of who your family is. Chloe Whitmore, however, struggled to adapt to this new reality. One afternoon, I passed her in the hallway. She looked exhausted. The confidence she had displayed only days earlier seemed diminished. Conversations stopped when she walked by. Friends who once surrounded her now appeared less eager to be seen at her side. It was not because anyone was seeking revenge. It was because people had started seeing her differently. Reputation can change quickly when public perception shifts. Meanwhile, the inquiry continued gathering momentum. Reporters uncovered old interviews. Former city employees agreed to speak publicly. Community members who had remained silent for years began sharing documents and records. Every new piece of information raised additional questions. Mayor Stephen Whitmore maintained his public composure, insisting he had nothing to hide. Yet each press conference seemed more tense than the one before. Even people who supported him were beginning to wonder what investigators might uncover next. One evening, my mother and I sat together in the living room watching a local news broadcast. A reporter described how multiple agencies were now reviewing materials connected to earlier projects and decisions. The story no longer focused on a single incident involving students. It had become part of a much broader examination of public trust. My mother remained quiet throughout the report. When it ended, she looked toward the window and said something I will never forget. The truth often takes longer than people expect, but once it starts moving, it rarely stops. The next morning, another major development occurred. Several former officials publicly confirmed they had been contacted by investigators. Some agreed to cooperate fully. Others released statements of their own. The story dominated local headlines. Across town, City Hall no longer felt untouchable. Questions arrived faster than answers. Meetings were held behind closed doors. Advisors appeared increasingly concerned. Even residents who had defended the mayor for years admitted the situation looked serious. As for me, I continued attending classes and trying to maintain a normal routine. Yet deep down, I knew we had crossed a point of no return. What began as an ordinary school day had evolved into something much larger than anyone could have predicted. And late that afternoon, a breaking news alert appeared on my phone announcing that investigators had scheduled a formal review hearing. The date was set. The process was moving forward. And for the first time, it seemed possible that some of the most powerful people in town would finally be required to answer difficult questions. The day of the review hearing arrived under gray skies and an atmosphere unlike anything our town had experienced before. By early morning, reporters had gathered outside the municipal building. News vans lined the street. Cameras pointed toward the entrance. Residents stood in small groups discussing possibilities and rumors. Some believed nothing significant would happen. Others believed the hearing would change everything. As I watched the coverage before school, I realized how far the situation had traveled from that lunch period only weeks earlier. What started as a moment witnessed by students had grown into a public examination of power, trust, and accountability. Throughout the day, updates appeared almost hourly. Teachers checked their phones between classes. Students whispered about breaking developments in the hallways. Even people who normally ignored local politics seemed unable to look away. Shortly after noon, the first major report emerged. Investigators had confirmed that multiple records would receive further review. Additional interviews had been conducted. Several former officials had provided statements supporting concerns that had circulated quietly for years. None of these announcements proved wrongdoing on their own, but together they painted a picture that became increasingly difficult to dismiss. Meanwhile, Mayor Stephen Whitmore appeared before reporters outside the hearing. He maintained a calm expression and repeated that he welcomed transparency. Yet something about the images felt different than before. The confidence that had once seemed effortless now appeared carefully managed. Questions came faster than answers. Journalists pressed for details. Residents demanded clarity. Public patience was beginning to wear thin. At school, Chloe Whitmore seemed almost invisible. She no longer walked through the hallways surrounded by attention. During lunch, she sat quietly at a table near the back of the cafeteria. Several students glanced in her direction, but quickly looked away. The contrast was striking. Only a short time earlier, she had carried herself with complete certainty. Now uncertainty followed her everywhere. For the first time, she appeared to understand that family influence could not control every outcome. That evening, my mother received another call from the person she had contacted weeks earlier. I listened as she thanked them and carefully wrote notes on a yellow legal pad. When the conversation ended, she sat silently for a moment. The review uncovered more than anyone expected, she finally said. Her voice carried no satisfaction, only seriousness. Whatever investigators had found, it was significant enough to push the process further. Over the next several days, new reports continued appearing. Community leaders who once avoided controversy publicly called for accountability. Editorials appeared in local newspapers. Former supporters of the mayor began distancing themselves from the administration. Even people who still respected Stephen Whitmore admitted that difficult questions deserved answers. The momentum seemed unstoppable. Then came the announcement that changed everything. A special press conference had been scheduled for the following week. No details were provided. No explanations were offered. Yet the reaction was immediate. Reporters speculated nonstop. Residents debated possibilities. Social media exploded with theories. Late that night, as I sat at my desk finishing homework, my phone lit up with another news alert. According to multiple sources, senior advisors inside City Hall were already preparing for major changes. And for the first time since this story began, it seemed possible that the future of Stephen Whitmore's entire career would be decided within a matter of days. The week leading up to the press conference felt endless. Every day brought new speculation, new headlines, and new conversations throughout town. People discussed the situation in grocery stores, coffee shops, and school hallways. It seemed impossible to escape. Even those who had never followed local politics now wanted updates. By Monday morning, reporters had begun arriving outside City Hall before sunrise. Camera crews positioned themselves along the sidewalks. Residents gathered nearby, hoping to witness whatever announcement was coming. Nobody knew exactly what would be said, but everyone understood that something important was about to happen. At school, the atmosphere was equally tense. Students refreshed news feeds between classes. Teachers reminded everyone to stay focused on academics. But curiosity was impossible to ignore. During lunch, I noticed Chloe sitting alone again. Her usual confidence had faded into something closer to uncertainty. For the first time since I had known her, she looked like an ordinary teenager caught in circumstances she could not control. I felt no satisfaction seeing it. Mostly, I felt surprised by how quickly life could change. Later that afternoon, the press conference finally began. My mother and I watched from our living room. Every local station carried the event live. Officials stepped to the podium one by one. Statements were read. Findings were summarized. Questions followed. The language remained formal and careful, but the message became increasingly clear. Concerns that had once been dismissed had now been taken seriously. Records had been reviewed. Testimony had been collected. Recommendations had been made. The investigation was not ending. It was expanding. As reporters continued asking questions, another announcement followed. Several senior advisors connected to the mayor's office would be stepping down immediately. The room erupted with activity. Reporters spoke over one another. Cameras shifted positions. Breaking news banners appeared across television screens. My phone began vibrating nonstop with messages from classmates reacting in real time. Then came the moment nobody expected. A statement from Stephen Whitmore was released through his office. He announced that he would temporarily step away from his responsibilities while the review process continued. For years, many residents had viewed him as politically untouchable. Now even his strongest supporters seemed stunned. Across town, reactions spread quickly. Some people expressed disappointment. Others expressed relief. Many simply seemed exhausted after years of unanswered questions. The story was no longer about one family or one incident. It had become a conversation about accountability and public trust. That evening, another development emerged. The cafeteria video, which had started everything in the public eye, was now being shared nationwide through larger news platforms discussing leadership and responsibility. Chloe's name appeared less frequently than before. Attention had shifted toward broader issues. Yet the connection remained impossible to ignore. One moment had opened a door that could never be fully closed again. As night settled over town, my mother sat quietly at the kitchen table reviewing notes she had collected throughout the process. Finally, she looked up and said something that stayed with me. Sometimes people spend years believing nobody is paying attention. She paused before continuing. Then one day they discover everyone was watching all along. And the next morning, an announcement arrived that would determine the future of Stephen Whitmore's career once and for all. The announcement arrived just after 8 o'clock on a rainy Thursday morning. I was standing at my locker when phones began lighting up across the hallway almost simultaneously. Students stopped walking. Conversations paused. Within seconds, everyone was reading the same headline. Mayor Stephen Whitmore had officially resigned from office. For a moment, the hallway felt frozen. Then whispers spread in every direction. Some students looked shocked. Others looked relieved. A few simply stared at their screens trying to process what they had just read. I opened the article and read every word carefully. The statement described the decision as being made in the best interest of the community while ongoing reviews continued. The language was professional and controlled, but the meaning was unmistakable. The political career that had dominated our town for years had reached an abrupt end. During first period, nobody could focus. Teachers attempted to continue lessons, but even they seemed distracted. Every few minutes another update appeared online. Reporters interviewed residents outside City Hall. Former supporters expressed disappointment. Community leaders called for a fresh start. The entire town seemed to be experiencing the same realization at the same time. Power that once appeared permanent had disappeared almost overnight. Later that afternoon, I saw Chloe for the first time since the news broke. She was leaving the administration building carrying a stack of books against her chest. There were no friends surrounding her. No attention. No confidence. She looked down as she walked through the parking lot. For a brief moment, our eyes met. I expected anger. I expected resentment. Instead, I saw something else. Embarrassment. Uncertainty. Maybe even regret. The truth was that Chloe had lost something too. She had spent years believing influence could protect her from consequences. Now she was learning a lesson many people never learn until much later in life. Respect cannot be inherited. It must be earned. That evening, my mother and I watched another news report from our living room. The story reviewed the events of the past several weeks. The cafeteria incident. The investigation. The public response. The resignation. Looking back, the sequence seemed almost impossible to believe. One moment had triggered another. One decision had exposed a larger pattern. One phone call had opened a door that years of silence had kept closed. My mother sat quietly through most of the broadcast. When it ended, she turned off the television and looked at me. "This was never about revenge," she said. "It was about accountability." I nodded because I finally understood. For weeks, people had assumed the story belonged to one family. In reality, it belonged to the entire community. It was about whether rules applied equally, whether truth still mattered, whether ordinary people could be heard. The following day, City Hall announced an interim administration while new leadership plans were developed. Local organizations began discussing reforms. Residents attended public meetings in record numbers. People who once felt ignored now participated openly. The town was changing. As I walked home from school beneath clearing skies that afternoon, I realized something remarkable. The story was no longer about the fall of one person. It was about what happened when a community finally decided that silence was no longer acceptable. And although the resignation marked the end of one chapter, another chapter was only beginning. 6 months later, life in our town looked very different. The constant news coverage had faded. The headlines had moved on. Camera crews were gone. Yet the changes left behind remained visible everywhere. Community meetings were better attended than ever before. Local leaders communicated more openly. Residents who once felt disconnected now participated in discussions about the future of the town. Trust, once damaged, was slowly being rebuilt through transparency and accountability. At school, the atmosphere had changed as well. New student leadership programs encouraged respect and responsibility. Teachers spoke openly about character, not just achievement. More importantly, students seemed less impressed by status and more interested in integrity. It was not a perfect transformation, but it was real. As for me, I was focused on graduation. College acceptance letters had arrived, and after weeks of careful thought, I chose a university several states away. The decision felt exciting and intimidating at the same time. For the first time, I was preparing to leave the place where this entire story had unfolded. One afternoon near the end of the school year, something unexpected happened. I was organizing books in the library when I heard someone quietly say my name. I turned and found Chloe Whitmore standing a few feet away. For a moment, neither of us spoke. She looked different than I remembered, not because of her appearance, but because of the way she carried herself. The arrogance that once surrounded her seemed gone. She looked nervous, almost uncertain. Finally, she took a breath and apologized. The words came slowly and without excuses. She admitted that she had spent years believing her family's influence made her important. She admitted that she treated people poorly because she never expected consequences. Most importantly, she admitted that she had been wrong. I listened quietly. Months earlier, I might have imagined this conversation differently. But standing there, I felt no anger. Time had changed too much. The truth had already done its work. I thanked her for being honest. Then we wished each other well and went our separate ways. Later that evening, I told my mother about the conversation. Laura Brooks smiled softly as she listened. When I finished, she set down her coffee cup and looked at me. "That is what accountability is supposed to do," she said. "Not destroy people. Help them become better." Her words stayed with me. In the months that followed, I thought often about everything that had happened. The cafeteria, the investigation, the resignation, the countless conversations that followed. Looking back, The most important lesson was not about politics or power. It was about choices. Small choices made every day. The choice to speak up. The choice to remain silent. The choice to treat others with respect. The choice to take responsibility when mistakes are made. Every consequence in this story began with a choice. On graduation day, I stood with my classmates beneath a bright blue sky as families filled the stadium seats. As names were announced and caps filled the air, I spotted my mother smiling proudly from the crowd. In that moment, I understood something I would carry with me for the rest of my life. Influence can open doors, but character determines what happens after you walk through them. Power may last for a season, but integrity endures. And sometimes the most important change begins when one ordinary person refuses to accept that the truth should stay hidden. As I walked across the stage toward the future waiting ahead, I felt grateful for every lesson that had brought me there. Because in the end, accountability had not only changed a town, it had helped people find a better path forward.